Welcome to the Performing Arts Series brought to you by the Kennedy Center and the Prince William Network. I'm Maria Salvador, your moderator for today's program. I'm joined in the studio audience by students from Hylton High School in Prince William County, Virginia. With us are three quite amazing people who've come together, along with 100+ other writers and illustrators, to create an informative, inviting, and altogether engaging book about a particular piece of property in Washington, D.C. Katherine Paterson is a two-time Newbery medalist, a winner of the National Book Award twice, and the recipient of the Hans Christian Andersen Award given by the International Board on Books for Young People for her lasting contribution to children's literature. Katherine Paterson's books, by the way, have been translated into 21 languages. Additionally, Ms. Paterson serves as Board Vice President for the National Children's Book and Literacy Alliance, the NCBLA. Stephen Kellogg has illustrated over 100 books and has both written and illustrated more than 30 books himself. It's not an exaggeration to say that picture book artist Stephen Kellogg is a part of children's literary lives. Not surprising, since he continues to stay in touch with them through school visits. In recognition of his lifetime contribution to children's literature, Mr. Kellogg is the recipient of the Regina Medal. He too serves as Vice President of the NCBLA Board. Mary Brigid Barrett is not only an award-winning writer and illustrator, but an educator and a passionate and persuasive advocate for literacy and libraries. And so, not surprisingly, she is the founder and president of the National Children's Book and Literacy Alliance. Ms. Barrett is also the educator of the book that we'll discuss today. Our White House, Looking In, Looking Out, was published by Candlewick Press and came out around the time the mansion was preparing for a change of residence. As David McCullough writes in the book's introduction, the White House is filled with, overflowing with stories. Let's hear about some of these from three of the book's contributors. Welcome to each of you.
Thank you.
Mary Brigid, you were the editor of the book. Can you tell us how this book came about?
Well, ever since I was a high school student, there was one question that one thing that I never really understood, and that was, we live in a democracy, and it's a three-branch government. You know, we have the judicial branch, we have the executive branch, and we have the legislative branch. And the legislative branch is supposed to be the we the people part, you know? And it always intrigued me why, in the rest of the world, why the Capitol building was not the symbol of American democracy to the rest of the world. Why did it end up being the White House? And I was also I was a little bit ticked off too, because, you know, we've had a succession of presidents from both parties that take their political agenda with them to the White House, and weren't they supposed to at some level rise to be the statesman and supposedly, weren't they supposed to represent all of us? And, and I'd never actually been to the White House, and then over the course of really like a year and a little bit longer, I ended up going there with one of my kids on the school tour. You know, we came from New England and we did the tour. And when you stand in line, or when you used to be able to stand in line, we were there, and Emily and I were standing there, and there was a profusion of, incredible languages going around us, because we were actually the only Americans standing in line to get into the White House. And we didn't know that in other countries you couldn't do this. You couldn't go into the executive branch and take a tour. It wasn't open like that. And then later, as an advocate for schools and libraries and reading, I ended up visiting the White House and met some wonderful young staff people after the official meetings, and they took me on tour. And I felt walking through this house the same way I did when I was a kid, and I was in, I think, 7th or 8th grade growing up in Cleveland, and I rode the then transit, the subway, into town for my first visit to the big, huge Cleveland Public Library branch. And when you walk through the main reading rooms of a public library, there is this feeling that, number one, wow, they're beautiful public spaces. And I thought, this is mine. These are my books. They're our books. They're your books as much as mine. And I had that feeling walking through the White House every time, the few times I visited, and going through all the rooms on the first floor, that this is not just this president's house. This is your house. It's my house. It's our house. And that perhaps we should start asserting that a little bit more, that it is our house. We have this illustrious board of authors and illustrators, not just Katherine and Stephen, but Pat and Fred McKissick and David McCulley, who did the cover for the book eventually, and Tobin Anderson and Patty McLaughlin. I mean, we have an incredible group and why can't we create this book? Why can't we, create this book that's going to hopefully get young people excited and also provoke them about thinking about our nation's future as well as our past.
Well, okay, you raise a really interesting point. How would you suggest that educators use this book?
Oh my gosh, there are so many ways that educators can use this book. For example, this is the opening double-page spread, and here you have George Washington overlooking the Potomac Valley before the city of Washington was ever built. I think one of the problems we have is that kids live, this is a TV culture. We live in a visual society, and there are no photographs of this era, and there are very few etchings. And so one of the tasks that we had in the book was, especially in that pre-photo era, to get illustrators to put energy and vitality into characters, to start to do some narrative visual work. And so we have beautiful illustrations like this that teachers can not only use to excite students about history, but they can also do a little bit of art appreciation. This is very representative of the Hudson School, the Romantic School, right, Stephen, of illustration. And so there are multiple ways that this book could be used in the classroom.
Okay. But in addition to editing your richly imagined piece is described as a memoir. You contributed to it. Mm-hmm. You call it an illustrated memoir. Tell us about the testimony that you created, and maybe even share a bit of it.
Well, I was asked by my fellow editors on the book to somehow talk about the entire construction of the White House. And I couldn't get a handle on it. I'm a fiction writer. I don't usually write nonfiction. And I'm very character-driven, extremely character-driven. And sometimes you just have to wait, don't you, Katherine, for that voice to come through. And I was intrigued because on the White House, the best architectural feature on the White House is stonework all around the White House. And most of it is of a floral or plant motif. And there are only 2 carvings in the entire White House that are human or animal or anything. It's not like the National Cathedral that has all the gargoyles that fascinate you. And on the very front door of the White House, where the president would walk through, and the White House didn't have those porticos on the north and south side, so the facade of the building was very, very flat when it was first built. And over it is this incredible stone arch. And at the very apex of the arch, the stone carvers actually carved 2 griffins, mythological creatures. Griffins were the animals, the mythological creatures that pulled the chariot of Alexander the Great. The griffin represents fortitude and wisdom, with wisdom always in the lead. And I started to think, who did this? There is no other place on the White House that there are any kind of anything that has this kind of symbolic portent to it. And here, above the door, where the president has to walk through, he has to walk under these griffins every single day. And a voice started to occur to me, and it was a voice of a young apprentice stonemason. And he spoke to me in an Irish brogue. And coincidentally, most of the stonemasons that came to build the White House were from Scotland. And the Colin Williamson, who was the sort of the guy in charge of all the Scottish stonemasons, was from Edinburgh originally, and he hated the Irish. He had nothing but disdain for these Irish immigrants that were coming in. And my family is half Scotch and half Irish, and it kind of got my Irish up. And I thought, what about if I made this stonemason and his father, who carved these griffins, Irish instead of all these Scottish stonemasons? And then while I was researching, I found an actual list. The White House is one of the most documented architectural structures in the United States, and you can actually go to the Library of Congress and the White House Historical Society, and you can see the list of who worked on this from the 1780s and 1790s. And I found out that there was a name of one apprentice, the only apprentice that worked for the stonemasons, and his name was Thomas Duran. And Duran is an Irish name, not a Scottish name. And so there was my character. So he comes from Ireland with his father, and they have to, you know, like walk and they have to catch a boat from Liverpool and come over here. And when they get to New York City, the people, the actual, they sort of sent out like an employment agency, because there wasn't skilled labor in this country. So they had to go to Great Britain and they had to bribe people to come here and instructed already. And of course it wasn't. And so, and they had them come by boat, and they wouldn't stop in New York for most of the ships that brought in the workers, because New York was this huge vital, you know, place already. And if you worked in New York as a skilled laborer, you got 10 times more money and 10 times more booze too on top of it. And
okay,
so
we have this character, and they're suddenly in Washington.
They're suddenly in Washington.
And so what happens?
And so what happens is they come here, and James Hoban, who was the architect of the White House, was actually Mr. Duran's old friend back in Ireland. He was the one that had them come over, and he introduces them to the rest of the Scottish stonemasons.
Now, what's fact and what's fiction in what you're saying now?
Well, actually, the only thing that is fiction in my piece are my two characters.
Okay.
I researched the, you know, and it was wonderful because I actually had an email correspondence with one of the stonemasons that worked on the National Cathedral to find out if everything in my piece was accurate and could have been done. And I said, you know, I'd like to have, you know, the Scotsman sort of test the Irish stonemason. And he said, actually, that happens all the time, that they put up a slab and say, go to it. And so the only part of my entire piece that's fictionalized is the actual two characters coming from Ireland.
Oh,
the life of the stonemasons, how, you know, where they lived, how they approached everything they used, the tools they used, everything is historically accurate.
Why don't you share your piece now?
Okay. In this piece, they have already begun working. His father, Patrick Thomas Duran's father, and himself have already begun working, and they've been carving the arch around the front door for days. Through oppressive heat and humidity, he worked, finishing most of the first griffin by the day's end. Of necessity, the stonemasons had drunk a great deal of ale and whiskey, especially those who worked high on the walls. The higher up a mason worked, the more whiskey he was allotted. My father was himself drenched in sweat. He sent me to fetch him a mug of ale, but I was curious to see how the work on the walls progressed and stopped to look at the men turning the treadmill, hoisting a stone block high in the air, maneuvering it into its place on the wall. I heard my father's call. I turned, watching him amble toward me from the shed. I knew I was in for a bit of a scold, having failed to return promptly with his drink. But it would be a light chiding, for he had an amused smile on his face. He knew too well my fascination with all aspects of construction. Neither of us heard the cable on the treadmill snap. I watched, unbelieving and helpless, as the stone block fell through the air, fell upon my father, crushing his chest. James Hoban helped me to arrange for my father's funeral and his burial in consecrated ground. There were no women to cry and keen for him, and so through the dark night I crept down to the river and in the reeds hid, mourning my father and my mother and all who had gone before me, my tears swallowed by the river and the black sky above. Too soon my father had been taken. I could not leave his work undone.
The White House has certainly changed over the years, hasn't it? Let's take a look at how it's changed inside and out.
In 1791, George Washington chose a site for the presidential house. James Hoban was selected to design the house, and the cornerstone was laid in October 1792. On November 1, 1800, John Adams became the first occupant of the White House. In the War of 1812, the house was burned to a ruin by British troops. Rebuilding it became a cause of national pride. The early to mid-1800s was an era of great technological innovation at the White House. The White House was viewed as a treasure, America's architectural marvel. But with Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, the house began to symbolize much more. It became an icon of all that America represented. In the years following the Civil War, another era of innovation came to the White House. Theodore Roosevelt brought dramatic changes to the look and function of the house in 1902. His architect, Charles McKim, tore down the great glass conservatories and moved the executive offices to the West Wing. The first half of the 20th century was an active and trying era at the White House. America endured, but in 1948, the White House showed signs of collapsing. Harry Truman directed the reconstruction of the house's interior. In the more than 50 years since its reconstruction, the White House has seen crisis and triumph. Yet through it all, it has remained an icon of all that America represents.
Katherine, you're best known for your fiction, albeit historical fiction, but your contribution to the book Our White House is nonfiction. Tell us a bit about your piece entitled The Eyes and Ears of the Public.
Well, it seemed to me that it was very important that people realize that we have representatives inside the White House, no matter who the president is. And those representatives are the members of the press. And their obligation is not to the president, but to us, to give us the news of what's going on inside the House, to find out all they can about what the president's doing, and also why, who he's talking to, where he's getting his advice, all of these things. And Harry Truman reminded the press that even though there are a lot of times Truman didn't like the press, they were the mouth of the public. And he learned from them what we, the public, were thinking. And so they were necessary to him as they are necessary to us.
Well, how different was your approach in writing information as opposed to your fictional characters? I mean,
well, I'm basically a storyteller, so it's going to be a story. And Mary Brigid provided me with a 19th century book that told about a woman who was maybe the first White House reporter, and she wrote gossipy things about the president's daughter, who was a teenager and went to far too many parties. So my original piece had a lot more about that in it, but the editors at Candlewick were trying to keep the pieces shorter, so there's only a brief mention of that in the book. But I think the White House reporter that all of us remember is Helen Thomas. I mean, do you know any other White House reporter's name off the bat?
No.
We all know
Not.
Helen Thomas in her red suit that sat on the front row for so long.
True.
And so she became the focus of the piece for me.
Interesting. How did you research it, though? I mean, you were inspired by a 19th century female reporter, but then how did you go about finding out more about Helen Thomas and
Well,
the
Helen
others?
Thomas has written a lot of books
That's
about
true.
her experience in the White House, so she was really quite easy to research.
Interesting. Stephen, I have to ask you a question. You found a way to bring your signature vibrancy to the pages of Our White House through the presidential pet. Tell us about it, and then, if you will, share the opening paragraph.
Well, as a fanatical animal lover who's always surrounded himself by dogs and cats throughout my life, and I know how important they are in my life, as I started reading about the presidents and wanted to humanize my contribution to the book, since I don't approach it so much as a political scientist, but more as a storyteller, kind of looking into the presidents' families and their more intimate life within the White House, I discovered that they all were almost exclusively they all had pets. Very few did not, and they were very devoted to their pets and got a tremendous amount of satisfaction out of pet ownership. And I thought, well, it'll be interesting to find out whether or not the choice of a pet and the relationship, that the president has with his or her pet tells something about the actual character of the man and his family. And so the research got quite extensive. It really got a bit beyond me because we had a bit of a tight deadline on this book. And so the daughter of some neighbors of ours had just graduated from Cornell. She was looking for a job, and she was. And I was telling her what I was working on. She said, "I would love it if you would hire me as a researcher." She said, "I will find out everything you need to know about the presidents and their pets." And so she embarked on that project and was incredibly helpful in terms of giving me all kinds of information I had not yet discovered in my more superficial perusal. And so, I also believe that humor has a very important part in stories and in our lives, actually. So I thought, well, the presidential pet is a pretty light subject, and so I really want this to be fun, kind of a nice change of pace from some of the more politically scientifically oriented parts of the book that are fascinating and wonderful. But I thought I'm going to do the presidential pet in kind of a fun way, so I decided I would do it as a dog show, and each of the presidents would be presenting their pet in competition with the others. Since we know, I think one of the qualities for a president, he or she has to be competitive, and by nature, in order to subject themselves to the grueling competition that leads up to the presidency. And so I thought that as we know, people's competitive instincts sometimes exhaustingly are visited on their children and on their pets. I thought I would approach it from that point of view.
Would you mind sharing the opening paragraph?
I'd be glad to. The presidential pet. Every 4 years after a national election, it is inevitable that the losing party will gloomily assert that the White House has gone to the dogs. In truth, however, the nation's most celebrated residence has always been a kennel, no matter which party was in power. Very few of our chief executives have dared to face the relentless stress of a term in office without the companionship, support, and solace that are unconditionally available from a devoted dog. Despite revelations of appalling presidential ineptitude or humiliating misbehavior or pitiable poll standings, the dog will never vote to impeach his master. He is the only constituent whose affection and loyalty are immune to disillusionment, and thus the unofficial cabinet post of first pet is crucially important to the security of any head of state. More than a few cats have served with distinction, and occasionally a representative of a less traditional species has occupied the post.
That's wonderful. We've heard about how Stephen and Katherine have researched their pieces for the book. Was this similar to the process that you had to go through?
I originally went to libraries. That's where I started, the Library of Congress, at the George Washington University, where I had a student allowed me to come in and do research there, and back in Massachusetts at the Antiquarian Association. I'm not going to get that right. I should look in the book. And when
Don't worry about it. We'll get it later.
Okay. And I loved going through old microfilm, because in some of our major libraries, you can actually read the newspapers of the 13 early states. There were major newspapers then, and in fact, in our book, we start off the book with an ad that was in the newspapers across the country, because they had to have a design contest to build the White House. And this was the ad that was written, that went in all the major newspapers, and I wanted to find it, to actually read it. You'll never guess, Maria, who wrote this ad.
Who?
Thomas Jefferson.
Really?
Yes, as a fourth grader at Sharon East Elementary Alternative School told me, it must have been a small country. That Thomas Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, also had to write the advertisement for the design for the newspaper. So, and it was great, because when you start doing that, when you start finding that, there's this serendipitous discovery that you go through, because you could read the ads in the colonial newspaper, or the early state newspapers. You can read. I discovered totally by accident in one of the Washington newspapers that was published in Georgetown that John Adams came to town yesterday with on horseback with his servant, and is moving into the White House tonight, basically. It was right there. The very first, and it was just like nonchalant. Well, John Adams is here, and it amazes me. I was just enthralled that I could do all of this.
So you must have been able to use your research skills as the editor to verify the information in all of the pieces.
Yes, and not only that, but our White House book has been chosen by the National Endowment for the Humanities as a We the People bookshelf selection.
Wonderful.
Which means it had to be vetted by the National Endowment for Humanities.
Wow.
And also by the American Library Association that actually helps choose these bookshelf pieces. And so this may be one of the most vetted books in the history of mankind, because I think the National Endowment for Humanities has a pretty, high level that you have to pass in order to get that accreditation. Yes.
Not too shabby. Were there any of these pieces that surprised either you, Stephen, or you, Catherine?
There were a lot of pieces that surprised me. How about you?
Yes, really.
It's Homer Hickam, isn't it? The October Sky, and he tells about as a kid meeting President Kennedy, and that's a wonderful. I won't tell you what he said because you need to read it for yourself. But that was a very surprising piece.
Yeah, yeah.
In addition to the presidents, too, many of our colleagues chose to write about people at the White House who would not have been known ordinarily. There was a black gentleman, Paul Jennings, who wrote the first White House memoir, and he wrote about his years there. As first of all, he was a slave working for the Madisons, and then he bought his freedom and became and worked for Daniel Webster for the rest of his life. And his memoir is so full of dignity and nobility. He's such an impressive man that I really love reading about him. Yeah.
And Maria, you were asking us how the book can be used in the classroom. Stephen bringing that up brings up an important section of the book. When we first went to contributors, as Catherine mentioned, we did ask them, what would they be interested in writing? And that, when I'm teaching writing to kids, I like to emphasize that to teachers, because so often kids are stuck having to write what other people want them to write. And it's very hard when you're not writing about something you care about to actually invest it with any kind of quality. And because our contributors were giving so much, we wanted to make it as creative a situation for them as possible. Many of the people, we don't know if it was subconsciously or consciously, wanted to write about the War of 1812 at the beginning. It came up as a choice quite often. And at first I didn't understand it, but then I realized, and this also was a point, a reference to historical illiteracy levels in this country. If you all remember when the Twin Towers came down, the newscasters on television all said, and this was almost without exception, that the only other time that the United States, the actual land of the United States, had been attacked was at Pearl Harbor. And in reality, in the War of 1812, the Capitol and the White House were totally burned. And Washington, D.C. was as attacked as strongly and emphatically as the Twin Tower situation. And if you go back and read primary sources at that time, you can tell by the primary source materials, by these eyewitness accounts, that they were just as devastated, this young country, as we were after September 11th. And I wondered if somehow subconsciously this was one of the reasons why so many people were attracted to write about this time period, because it's not like one of the most popular time periods in American history. And so what we did was we had a historian write, actually Ralph Ketchum, right, about the actual historical fact of what happened during the War of 1812. And he is a Madison scholar in the country, so it was very appropriate. Then another writer wrote about the whole Dolly Madison legend. And then I was thinking, why not use this to create a teaching moment for parents and teachers in a classroom? One of the things that all of us face in contemporary culture, and if you're a historian, you face this on your journey, is finding contradictory primary and secondary source accounts. And who do you believe and who do you not believe? And so I thought, why not purposely put in contradictory information information. So we have Susan Cooper, who is a wonderful fiction writer, writing an imagined letter by a British soldier who is actually exultant that he built the White House, to show the other side of the fence. And then in doing the research for the White House, I came across what Stephen was talking about, this incredible journal entry by Paul Jennings that actually contradicts the story that Dolly Madison personally saved the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington. And he was an eyewitness that day. He actually tells you what happened that day. The table was all set for dinner, and the British soldiers ate the dinner that President Madison, he left. They left. They ran away in actuality. The president left, and Dolly left, and everybody left. And, my question to talk about at home and in the classroom is, why was Paul Jennings' voice silenced for 200 years? I mean, the journal was not just a recent discovery. It's been out there. A lot of historians have known about it. How come when I read my history textbook when I was a junior and senior in high school, how come I didn't read about Paul Jennings as much as I read about the legend? And another question is that why do we want to always believe the legend so much sometimes? Why do we want to read the fictionalized version of things and we have like an affinity for that? And sometimes we don't want to remember the actual facts. So we actually built in the book, a couple of times in the book where we have contradictory pieces of information so that young people can experience the journey of what a historian really does, and also to reflect on our contemporary culture where we have an increasing media that tends to have a bias and that, to encourage young people to seek multiple perspectives in responsible information sources.
Well, it was interesting for me, I know, to see the inside of the White House from one of its former residents. Linda Robb Johnson is the eldest daughter of Lyndon Baines Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson, and writes about having lived in the White House in a piece called My Room.
Now, I'd have to tell you that any of the people that have ever lived there thinks it's their house and their room, and when we go back, at least for me, when I've gone back, I look at it and I think, what have they done to my room? They've moved that picture, and that's not where that chair was. And oh no, look, they have changed the wonderful fabric on the sofa in the yellow room. Why did they do that? Because, at least from my standpoint, when we were there, it was perfect. I am one of those people who is looking out. And so, here we go. My room. I was a sophomore in college, living away from home in a dorm at the University of Texas. Then suddenly, everything changed. After the assassination in November of 1963, my parents decided that if I lived with them, I would not only be safer, but I would also be of help to them. So I came to Washington, D.C. to live in the White House. I envisioned the family quarters at the White House decorated with antiques, every piece with a fascinating historical provenance. When I arrived in my room, previously occupied by Caroline Kennedy, I found no antiques, only the same furniture that had been in my old bedroom. There were antiques in the official rooms on the first floor, but the family quarters were furnished with a mixture of furniture that Mother had found at the government warehouse and pieces she had brought from our previous homes. I had imagined that I would be sleeping in a bed christened by Abigail Adams herself, our first White House First Lady. At least in one of the ones that Andrew Jackson or one of the Teddy Roosevelt children had used. Instead, it was just like home, only with a more exciting view. My room on the second floor faced the entrance on Pennsylvania Avenue and overlooked the large lantern above the main White House entrance. Here, heads of state would arrive for state dinners. Although official dinners didn't happen often, 5 days a week, tourists finished their tours by going out that same door and down the driveway back to Pennsylvania Avenue. In our day, the White House was open for special tours early in the morning and then on a first-come, first-served basis from 10 to noon. After walking through the rooms on the ground floor and ceremonial first floor, the sightseers would exit right under my bedroom. What a noise they would make. Some days when I was trying to sleep late or when I was studying, I felt like opening the window and dropping a water balloon on them. Wisely, I never did. I imagined that hundreds of famous people had shared that room with me throughout the ages. As a history student, I decided I would try to discover the facts about this room's historical life. I visited the White House curator, who couldn't recall any famous people who had shared that room. I interviewed President Eisenhower when he came for a visit. He remembered only that Queen Elizabeth's lady-in-waiting had stayed there, at least he thought she did. I was finding out that not only had George Washington not slept there, but no one famous had. Finally, I gave up on my search. After that, all the discoveries I made about my room came by accident. In a movie, I heard that after little Willie Lincoln died, they locked up his room, never to go in it again. What room was that? I asked the curator. That was your room, Linda. Then I read a book that revealed that after President Lincoln was shot, his body was brought back to the White House, where the autopsy was performed. It described a long hallway leading to the room where it took place. Yes, it was my room. The bad news didn't stop there, for death seemed to follow my room. I soon learned that only a short time before I moved in, President Truman's mother-in-law had died in my room. That was the last straw. My curiosity had uncovered information that was better left swept under the rug, no matter who had stood on it before.
Were there other surprises in this book for you, Katherine, and you, Stephen? And particularly, Stephen, were there surprises visually for you?
I think when we as board members saw all the artwork and coming in and had one meeting where we saw it all together, and we were really dazzled by the depth of commitment that all of our colleagues made to really raise the level of this book to being even no one was paid. It was all donation, and they had put such care and thought and time into their contributions, and then we talked about how to put the artwork that came by itself together with some of the written pieces. And there was one that I love so many of them, but David Slonin did this beautiful illustration of the American wilderness that I thought was really just such a spectacular painting, it was matched up with Jean Greig George, a very well-known naturalist and a wonderful author, and she did an essay called Executive Order for Nature. And since I live in the Adirondacks, Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, was one of the first pieces of preserved land. It was decreed by Congress when they saw that during the Industrial Revolution, the East Coast was becoming totally polluted with coal fumes and deforestation and the Catskill Mountains, and they decreed that the Adirondack Mountains should be quote unquote forever wild. And I think that's I living in them. I love that because I hike in them all the time and feel this is a real gift from the past that someone had the foresight to do that. And she wrote, "Love of nature lies deep in the American psyche. We inherited a wilderness, and deep in our hearts, we long to maintain stream-like diversity from sea to shining sea. Said a voter in the Bronx, New York, I may never see a grizzly bear or a giant redwood tree. I just want to know they are there. It is the White House where the fountainhead of preservation movement erupted into a benevolent geyser. The conservation movement, how has it gone so wrong?" Which is an invitation to us to write it, to write that movement, and make sure it goes right again. And that's the flexibility that we have as Americans to amend something that's gone awry and gone wrong. We voted in new presidents, voted in new Congress members, get involved ourselves to get the country back on track again. And I think that combination of the illustration and the text are particularly arousing and moving in that effect.
I like, and I'm not sure if it ever got in the book, but of course there was a lot of fight early on how much power people should have. And Thomas Jefferson, I think, was the one who said that if you're worried about the power that people have, you don't take away the power, you educate the people. And this is one thing we're trying to do with this book, is to help educate people about the power that we really have as citizens.
What continues to influence you as as you contributed to this book, but moved beyond this book too?
Well, you know what? I'm sitting right next to two inspiring people. When I decided I was an illustrator, and I did advertising illustration. I had no idea how to do narrative illustration, how to tell a story. And studying Stephen Kellogg's work was an amazing experience for me to understand how he designs a page, how he has this energy of line and movement. And if you read Stephen's books, they're alive. The characters are alive. They actually come off the page and with energy and vitality. And when I thought, oh my gosh, I should write too, I went to my local library, and the librarian there, Maria Fox, said to me, well, you know what, you've got to start reading at least 20 books a week if you want to become a writer, because the best way to be a great writer is to be a great reader. And in my first pile of 20 books, at least I think 5 to 7 of them were Katherine's. and I read all of Katherine's books in one weekend. And whenever I wonder as a writer how I should handle something, what I need to do, I look to Katherine's work, and as an illustrator, I look to Stephen's work and other of our colleagues. And although Katherine might claim she's not a teacher, in actuality, she's one of the best teachers I've ever had.
It's really wonderful.
Thank you very much, Mary.
It's true.
Well, what
True.
influences are there on you as a writer, Katherine?
I read all the time. I mean, I think of myself as more of a reader than a writer. And I don't read I read a lot of books for kids and young adults, but I also read a lot of nonfiction. I read a lot of fiction for adults. And I get a little nervous about people say, well, I never read fiction for adults anymore. It's so terrible. I just read books for kids. And I think, no, you have to stretch. You have to stretch. Yeah. And also, I like to read books by people from other cultures. And, you know, my favorite writers are either Russian or Norwegian, so of course read them in translation, which I guess my favorite writers are translators, if I say that, because of course it's very difficult to translate a book. I've done a little teeny bit of translation myself from Japanese, and I know how hard it is. But there's such a treasure in a library. I just can't believe how rich we could all be, and
And it's free.
And it's free. It's free.
It's true. Well, Stephen, I have to ask you the same question. You know, what influences, you've mentioned humor, and humor is a thread that runs through your work, both in text and in illustration. So what were the inspirations for the humor in your book?
Well, I believe in the curative power of laughter. I think this is, you know, that the humor really is something that is almost uniquely human, and it's a universal language. I think that if we can laugh, it has a wonderful healing kind of a property to it, and it also helps to bond people together, and it's a way of reaching across cultures, because I think we all love to laugh, and when we laugh, defenses break down, and people can build bridges to each other. And that's the same thing with books, I think, and with stories. Stories are a way of reaching out. You give someone the gift of your story, you invite them to give a gift of story back, and you build bridges and bonds to each other, and you're changed by each other's stories. And I think the stories in this book, we've tried to humanize the presidents and also the people who support the presidents, the people who, I really love the editor's idea for the title of the book being Looking Out, Looking In, because the White House really includes all of us, both outside and inside, and really is the symbol of what makes this country potentially so extraordinarily wonderful.
One thing, I was thinking the other day about the journey for a title for this book, which just seemed so difficult to come up with a title that would really express what the book was about. And I thought, why did it take us so long to come to the idea of our White House? You know, we were calling it the White House, and then suddenly, was that your brilliant idea, Mary Brigid? That it was going to be our White House?
A consensus idea.
And suddenly we thought, well, that's it. And if you look at the jacket, you see all of us playing on the White House lawn. And that's the feeling we should have about it. This is our house, and what happens in this house matters to us, and we should have a say in what happens in this house, because it is our house. And so I love the fact that it's called Our White House.
I was actually thinking of something else, going back to the humor that Stephen talked about. Stephen, do you think that humor also is a way to the truth, because, you know, it gives you objectivity?
I do.
You know, when I was thinking with contemporary kids, you know, The Daily Show has become so popular, and thinking about how sometimes in, you know, recent presidential elections, and that humor, whether it's an editorial illustrator in a newspaper, or it's a comedy show like Saturday Night Live or The Daily Show, or in a book, you know, with a wonderful humorist like you, that it gives us, it makes us less subjective, and we are able to lift up and see things far more subjectively, and laughing at ourselves, sort of accept the truth, you know, especially if it's a difficult truth sometimes.
Right. It also helps us to be gentle with ourselves and gentle with each other.
To each of you, what do you hope to achieve through this book, through the individual pieces of it, and as a whole?
Well, one thing I hope is that in reading the book, you'll see what a rich heritage we have in the past, and what responsibilities we have for the present and the future.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a collection of stories, and I think each of us is creating a story with our own lives, and the people who lived in the White House and live in the White House, the people who support the White House, are all blending their stories together. And in the book, we have a variety of stories about presidents. We see them not only as heroic, but also as very vulnerable, sometimes grief-stricken. We see them as family members who are succeeding or failing, and expressing their feelings about parenthood in their letters to their children, and in their thoughts about their lives and their term in office versus the intimacy of trying to keep their families blossoming and healthy, and pooling all that together, I think makes the White House, indeed our White House, a much more human place.
I think that, number one, as a literacy advocate, I'm really hoping that young people read more about American history, and I hope they find something in this book, some president that intrigues them, and an event that intrigues them, and sort of inspires them to go out seeking, you know, their own sort of investigative journey on American history. But also, you know, building on what Stephen said too, I'm hoping that through all the pieces in the book, and the places where there is contradictory information, that not just the students and the young people reading the book, but their parents and teachers too, start to think more about making that extra effort to seek reliable information, both of the past and of the future. You know, not just to rely on the internet, because there is a reason why that we talk about surfing the internet. I found in doing my research for this that, you know, the internet provides very superficial information and very cliche information. You see the same things repeated over and over again. And it was really in digging down deep and starting to read more books, peeling back those layers of history, that you really start to find the truth. And in example after example in the book, it's taking the layers off, digging down deep, almost like you were talking about archaeologists, getting to the core of the truth. And that only happens when you get into a library, and when you stop sitting in front of a computer and actually go out and visit some of the sites, to walk through Mount Vernon, to walk through Montpelier, to go to the presidential sites, to visit the Kennedy Library in Massachusetts. It is an amazing thing to be able to see and touch history, to hold it in your hand. You know, that kind of experience. I hope this is a springboard for further journeys.
What had occurred to me too, from what Katherine said, as well as what you said too, is that we're living history.
Yes.
Our stories will be tomorrow's history.
Yes. Oh, and one thing that the book did for me, because I've read it through more than once, as instructed to, because we're going to be talking about it to all these people, was to see what's missing. You know, we tried to have as complete a story as we could, but of course, as big as it is, some presidents are covered much more fully than others. And I've been living in Vermont for 22 years, and all of a sudden I thought, where is Calvin Coolidge? Now, Calvin Coolidge is a media joke. He's Silent Cal. And the story's about Cal feeding his cat milk from his saucer at the table and during a formal dinner. You know, all of these sort of jokes about Calvin Coolidge. Well, if you live in Vermont, you realize what an extraordinary person Calvin Coolidge was. So when I realized that Calvin Coolidge had been given short shrift in our wonderful book, I said, well, on the website, we're going to do something about Calvin Coolidge. And that's the joy that we will have a website where we can expand on
extend the
things.
information.
But I do hope that reading the book, people will do like I did. They'll say, well, where is
What's missing?
what's missing? And that will drive you into further research, because it sent me immediately to read more about Calvin Coolidge.
And you know, the other thing too that's really wonderful is we went out of our way to make this an interdisciplinary book. We wanted to have poetry, we wanted to have art, we wanted to have literature in this book. If we could have put music in this book, we would have put music in this book. And to encourage young people that you don't have to be a historian to get into American story. You can be a fiction writer and do historical fiction. You can be a composer like Aaron Copland and, you know, write Appalachian Spring, which celebrates America on a whole other level. You can be a choreographer like Martha Graham. You can be a television screenplay writer like Aaron Sorkin, who, if you became an addict of West Wing, like I have to confess I did, you learned so much about American history through, you know, through so many different art forms. And it's all about celebrating this incredible heritage that all of us share, whether we came here yesterday or whether our families were present here thousands and thousands of years ago. It's all of our history.
And what I hear you saying is that there are many approaches to achieve this, you know, a steeped history. I mean, history. One of the things that intrigued me about the book was the various forms that the entries took. There's fantasy, there's straight nonfiction, there's memoir, there are primary sources, there are way secondary sources. But I think it's all very intriguing, and I think it corresponds to what you're suggesting, Mary Brigid.
And people often ask me, well, what age is the book for? It's for all ages.
Well, I think it's for whoever reads it.
A preschooler would spend hours over Stephen's illustration of the pets of the White House, and you could talk with his mother or father for days about, you know, why does that man have a ram? He'd never heard of somebody having a ram for a pet, or an owl, or various things. Or you can have adults pondering some of the puzzles of the book and the contradictions of the book.
Yes.
Or learning new information, as certainly all of us did. As we read the book and as we did research for the book. So there's no bottom or top age limit for this book, but we do hope it'll be a book that adults and young people and children enjoy together, because we feel like it's a great book for talking and thinking and discussing about what it means to be.
Turn the TV off one night.
Well, I mean, that's possible. You know, it does have an on-off button.
Yeah.
Even the remote has an on-off.
Well, all three of you are known for writing for young people. Are there is there a particular responsibility as an author and illustrator for young people?
I think we have a responsibility to give them the very best writing, the very best artwork that we can possibly do. We're shaping their creative judgment and introducing them to the whole world of literature and art, and we want to make sure that introduction is a solid and a beautiful cornerstone that hopefully they will build on for the rest of their lives. So I think that really challenges us.
That's absolutely true. I also feel, as writer primarily of fiction, that I owe honesty to my readers.
Well, you once said that we owe children hope, and maybe that's what differentiates adult books from books for young people. How does this book present hope to our young people and to the adults in their lives?
Well, if you think about that little group of men and women who thought it might be good to start a new country, and by doing so were risking literally their own necks, because if they had lost the war, they would have all been hanged.
And they didn't know it was going to happen.
And they didn't know what it was going to happen.
We're looking back on it, and they are living it in real time. You know, they had no idea what was going to happen.
Now that's an example of hope and courage that I don't think many of us possess today.
And also, we hope that when kids read this book, they see themselves as being our leaders of tomorrow. You know, that that they see that, as Stephen said, that our leaders are human beings. They're not perfect. They make mistakes. Sometimes they make big mistakes. Sometimes they make, they have exciting successes, and they react to the times. That, I think when I look at my 3 kids in our house, I always try to help them to see that no personality characteristic is intrinsically good or bad. It just works or doesn't work within a given set of situations. So, you have a president with, an embrace life, go out there, grab life, and you pull yourself up by the bootstraps and everything. Teddy Roosevelt, who embraces everything in a big, big way. Well, sometimes in history, that might not be the kind of president we need. And in another time, he could be the best, those characteristics. So I hope that when kids, look at this, they not only see hope for our country, but also hope for themselves, that you don't have to be perfect, that if you really believe in something, things can happen, that the world is not this dark, horrible place that sometimes we adults find that it is. There is always tomorrow, there is always change, and that if you have a passion for something and you're willing to work your butt off, that's the other thing, you have to be able to persevere, that you can have dreams and those dreams can come true.
Well, this book certainly makes the White House accessible as we look in and look out. It was a pleasure to be with each of you today. Thank you, Mary Brigid Barrett, Katherine Paterson, and Stephen Kellogg.
Thank you.
Thanks, too, to the students from Hylton High School for joining us today. Katherine, do you want to share a final thought with us today?
John Adams was the first occupant of the White House, and the first night he spent there, he wrote a letter to his wife, Abigail, and in that letter he included this prayer for the White House. I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof.
Meet the artists after the show. You and your students can ask questions of the artists after each broadcast by emailing us at kcperfarts@aol.com. Don't forget to visit us online. There you'll find dozens of archived programs from previous seasons that feature artists such as members of the National Symphony Orchestra, Ballet Hispanico, the Billy Taylor Trio, lyricist Stephen Schwartz, cast members from MAME, and many more. Prepare for each program by downloading the study guide. Each guide includes background information about the artists, instructional activities, and additional resources to use in the classroom. The Kennedy Center Performing Arts Series, bringing the arts to your classroom. Watch the most historic interview of all time as former President Richard Nixon and British talk show host David Frost face off in the new play Frost-Nixon. History and theater come together in this discussion with cast members Stacy Keach and Alan Cox, along with moderator Colleen Sinnott-Jennings, as they relive the Watergate scandal, the powerful television interview, and the apology the world was waiting to hear. Frost-Nixon will be broadcast on Tuesday, November 25th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. The Kennedy Center Performing Arts Series, bringing the arts to your classroom.